All right, let's do this. Welcome to Tell Me About It, a podcast by SLPs for everybody. My name is Francie.
And I'm Maggie.
And today we are continuing our conversation about the road to eligibility.
Yes, we are continuing in our series talking about special education evaluation and IEP testing, that kind of thing in public schools in the state of Missouri, because like we talked about a couple episodes ago, it's different in every state. So yeah, that makes it a little confusing for people who are outside of Missouri listening to this. And if you're thinking, oh, that's not how we do it here in, Iowa, it's like, yeah, it's different everywhere.
You are correct.
You are correct. So last time we talked about, we kind of touched on statistics as they apply to evaluation and standardized testing. Neither one of us are mathematicians, and so it wasn't like a deep dive into the world of statistics really, but yeah, just kind of talking about what like a standard bell curve is, why you need to know about it, what a standard score is, norm reference testing, that kind of thing. And today we are going to be talking about the eligibility meeting. So go ahead.
Yeah, everything that we talked about in last episode will be applied in today's episode. So that's kind of the background information that you need to know so that we can go into talking about eligibility and be informed. And so in the state of Missouri, I forgot how we wanted to start this. You want to start with?
Let's start. Actually, I thought of something that we didn't chat about before. Let's start up top by saying schools do not diagnose. So schools can identify, and we are going to be using the words identification and eligibility categories, eligibility criteria, not diagnosis. If we do, it's probably a slip of the tongue, because those two things are different. So schools don't diagnose disorders, they identify disabilities. And that semantic difference is really important, because for several of these, you or a student could have a medical diagnosis of a certain disorder, disability, what have you, and still not qualify for an IEP at a school because it has not been identified as a disability. So it's not, that diagnosis is not disabling to them in the academic setting.
And that's the important part. It has to have an educational impact. And so you can have autism and not be impacted educationally and not get an IEP. However, we have to go through this whole process to determine, and once again, referring back to the previous, you have to go through the RTI process, you have to go through the testing and blah, 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 to determine whether or not the disability medically impacts educationally. So, important note to go into this, because I get that question a lot from parents saying, we have a ADHD diagnosis, autism diagnosis, what have you. And then I have to be like, that's great. Let me tell you about this multi-step process in determining whether or not it actually impacts their education. So.
Yeah. And determining impact on education can be tricky sometimes. And I definitely have mixed feelings about this kind of line that we draw. And I know that you do too, Francie, of like, in my brain as a clinician, there are lots of things that impact a child's ability to participate in the school day that aren't just grades and academics. So for me, social impacts is academic impact. And we'll see that a lot of times with medical diagnoses of autism. And if the student is cognitively, like intellectually within the average range, they're probably doing fine grade-wise, but really struggling socially, or with transitions, or with other aspects of the school day. And so for me, that's academic impact. But I have worked on teams before, IEP teams, that where that doesn't really count as enough of an impact to qualify them for an IEP. So some of this is left up to interpretation, and it ultimately, like, that's why we have IEP teams with lots of different members on them. And again, like we said in our first episode in this series, parents and caregivers are a member of the team and a valued member. So yeah, it does boil down to academic impact, but from time to time, there's a little bit of room for interpretation as to what that means. So, and we'll get into that with some of the eligibility categories as well, because there's a lot of things that can impact a kid's day at school. So, shall we?
Yeah. Do we want to start with talking about if you don't have an educational impact, what options are available to you as well? As we've talked about, you can have a medical diagnosis that maybe does impact you, but not in the way that accessing your education would. And in that case, something is available to you called a 504 plan. This is from Section 504, goes along with the IDEA legislation. And actually, Section 504 came first when it comes in like the timeline of disability rights in the United States. But a 504 plan does not change curriculum. That's the important part and the important distinction between a 504 plan and an IEP. An IEP is an individualized education plan. We are modifying the academics to be able to be more accessible. For a 504 plan, the layman way to describe it is you're changing the environment. I have personal experience with 504 plan. I was on a 504 plan for most of elementary school and then part of middle school. Due to having a medical diagnosis that impacts my joints and my ability to write. I had accommodations for writing and using alternative utensils. And then I also had accommodations for having extra time out of my day to be able to go to the nurse, take medication, do pain management things. And so while I had a medical diagnosis that impacted my ability to participate in school, that's why I had accommodations, but I didn't impact my ability to learn. And so that was why I was on a 504 plan. So great distinction there. However, if you have a child with a disability that does impact education, we have 16 identification criteria that are eligibility criteria that we're getting ready to talk about. So 504 plans, own beast, still a way to get accommodations, but not a way to change the curriculum. So with that leads us into eligibility criteria.
Yeah. So really briefly, we are going to be focusing the majority of our time onto school age criteria. And what we mean by that is when kids enter kindergarten. When I worked in a public preschool, we talked about kids getting their big kid diagnosis. We called it a big kid diagnosis. Again, it's not a diagnosis, it's an identification, blah, blah, blah. We got there. We talked about kids getting their big kid identification because when you enter the public schools and are identified as needing an IEP in early childhood, those kids will receive an identification of young child with a developmental delay, or YCDD. This is a pretty general identification. And for the school system, it usually doesn't really get specific until kindergarten, when they will undergo another evaluation and round of testing with different criteria for qualifying for special education as an elementary school student. So that's a little bit confusing. There is a pretty sizable difference between how special education works at the preschool level and at the elementary school level, which can be really confusing for a lot of families, and frankly, can be confusing for a lot of professionals too. My jump from working in early childhood to K through 5 was I had to do a lot of learning on the job because I was like, oh gosh, my professional experience before this was, same but different. So but yeah, you'll see that YCDD, or young child with a developmental delay, kids will age out of that eligibility identification.
Yes, if you have a child who's identified YCDD, you have to rehold all of this testing to get a school age diagnosis. It used to be 6. I think it's now 7. I don't 100% know. But you'll have to complete all of that testing to find a school age, if they qualify for a school age diagnosis, because I've also had kids have been on YCDD for 3 years or 2 years. They come to kindergarten and they test out. And now they are not on any type of special education plan. which I guess is kind of the purpose of early intervention, which different conversation. What's what you hope for, right? Anyways, you'll have to hold all of this before a certain birthday because then you have to qualify for school age. And when it comes to school age identifications, there are 15 of them. We'll list them. Do you want to list and talk, or just list and then talk?
Let's list all of them now, and then
Perfect.
we're going to briefly touch on each of these and just kind of talk about like what kind of profile might fit one of these identifications. And then we're going to get into kind of more specifics about ones that we as speech therapists see the most on our caseloads.
Perfect. So I have, going back to our favorite website, Desi, I have, if you are
Said
able
with
to
a heavy amount of sarcasm.
heavy amount of sarcasm. It's so hard to navigate, guys.
Oh,
Anyways,
sorry. There was one more thing I wanted to talk about kind of up top. So along with quote unquote aging out of that YCDD identification, they might get to kindergarten and not qualify for special education. We talked kind of last time about standard deviations, standard scores, that kind of thing. And I'm assuming today we will get more into the eligibility criteria. So what scores they actually would have to receive on some of these tests and evaluations to qualify for special education. And I just want to say, just because your child does not qualify for special education doesn't mean that they don't have a disability or impairment of some kind.
We will say this every episode.
Yes.
It is very hard to qualify for special education in the state of Missouri. And so, no, we will always try to emphasize this because we don't want to ever gloss over and be like, oh my gosh, they're fine, they're perfect. No, just because they don't qualify, yes, Maggie, does not mean that they won't have struggles or it won't be hard for them. So anyways, always want to start with that.
Yeah. And I feel like I walk the balance as a professional of like, I don't want to be too, I guess, like maybe deficit focused of saying like, it's really hard to qualify for special education, meaning, you know, the natural conclusion of that is like, if you do qualify for special education, you're pretty severely impacted. And like, yes, it, in some ways that is true. But it doesn't mean, I don't want that to come across like prognostically as like a doom and gloom type of a thing, because just because kids need support and sometimes a lot of support in school doesn't mean they'll need that support forever. And it also doesn't mean that they're not capable of learning or excelling in school. So just wanted to get that out of the way up top. But yeah, let's go ahead and list those 15 school age eligibility categories.
Absolutely. First category, autism. Next category is deafblind. Next category, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment / deafness, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, learning disability, language impairment, sound system disorder, speech, specifically fluency, speech, specifically voice, traumatic brain injury, vision impairment are 15. And then, of course, YCDD, which is your early childhood diagnosis. Or see, here we go again with diagnoses, early childhood identification.
It's really hard for us to not say diagnosis because I don't know. I don't know why it's hard to like get rid of that terminology.
I think
it's not a diagnosis,
right.
But
I think for speech path, because I actually referred to speech therapists as daywalkers the other day, because we like we like operate. Have you ever seen Blade? No? Okay.
Oh, I know what you mean though. I know like what a daywalker is, but I was like, say more about that.
I made that reference and nobody understood it the other day. And I was like, okay, it is me.
I didn't know it was a vampire thing.
Okay.
But that's because I'm a huge nerd. So
okay, pot, high kettle. So here we are. I referred to speech paths as daywalkers the other day because we really exist in multiple worlds. We exist in special education, we exist in reg ed, we also exist in the medical world. And so it's sometimes easy for us, I know specifically for you and I, to jumble that up because sometimes we are working with diagnoses, sometimes we're working with that identification, and I get my wires crossed frequently. So
Totally.
there's going to be my caveat as to why we are particularly prone to mixing up those labels, is because we do exist in a world where we do talk about diagnoses sometimes. And so
it's going to be hard for us to not say diagnosis, but we're going to try. And just know that we know schools don't diagnose.
And just know, in all of my paperwork, it says identification. So.
Yes, we do proofread.
We do proofread.
But yeah, there's a lot of vocab bouncing around up here in these noggins. So okay. And I was just checking for my own edification. Yes, these eligibility criteria are listed in alphabetical order. So
they sure are. They are not listed, in any way other than alphabetical. So anyways, if you are on the DESE website, you are able to click on them and it pops up a big, long spreadsheet that talks about everything it takes to qualify for, or the eligibility criteria. And it talks about the legal requirements and the indicators for those legal requirements. So take, for example, autism, just because it's the first one, we're starting today. For autism, you would have to have an evaluation report, and that's our an evaluation report that uses all of the following procedures to address the areas of concern. So this goes back to our review of existing data. You would have to have a review of medical records, an observation of the child's behavior across multiple environments, and an in-depth social history. An evaluation report, the next little box down, an evaluation report documents the evaluation report documents disturbances of speech, language, cognitive development, and nonverbal communication in one or more of the following areas. They would have abnormalities that extend beyond speech into many aspects of the communication process, absence of communication, communicative language, or if present, lack of language communicative intent, characteristics that involve both deviance and delay. And of course, we're using state language that is so deficits-based, which really grinds my gears, but that's okay.
Yes. And we'll get to that in a second, because that is a really good point that we absolutely should talk about. But yes, so keep going.
So you would have to have a review of records. You'd have to have some type of documentation about speech and language ability and communication. You would also have to have some type of social history talking about difficulty with social communication or social relationships, having high amounts of rigidity. And so you would have to have all of this, and also impacts their educational performance, right? It goes on to have more ways. However, all of this to say, interestingly, if you have the medical diagnosis of autism, that would obviously be in the health section. However, for Missouri, and I'm thinking this is still true, you can not have a medical diagnosis of autism and still have educational autism. So if we do all of the evaluation and we meet all of these standards and indicators, even if we don't have a medical diagnosis of autism, you could still qualify under the autism category. So it puts up all of these ways that you could, or things that you have to look at and criteria that you have to meet in order for this to be considered at this eligibility meeting for a possible way for your child to receive services. And you can have a way to, and we'll talk about this more as we talk about eligibility criteria and the different, and we get into the nitty gritty of each one. You can, at an eligibility meeting, an initial eligibility meeting, have multiple areas of qualification. And that's the point of the team, was they would look at all of the standards and indicators for each identification and help pick one that they feel like is the best description of what the child needs support in. So I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think a really helpful way to think about this is kind of as a checklist for differential diagnosis. So
beautiful.
Again, there's that diagnosis word again.
Beautifully put, Maggie.
Yes, but for us as professionals, it's important that we know kind of like the root of the issue. Like if we've got a student that's struggling in school, we want to know why, so that we can adjust intervention accordingly. So yes, it is important that we kind of get down to the brass tacks of like, what is going on with this student? And so that's why there's things like, we need an in-depth social history. There's also 600.5 for that eligibility criteria for autism. Autism is eligibility code 600. 600.5 is that the evaluation report documents that the conclusion of the child being eligible for identification under autism is not the result of something else, specifically an emotional disability. So that kind of differential piece there of like, we need to make sure that it is actually autism that is affecting their time at school, their ability to participate academically, and not something else that's perhaps more applicable.
Yeah, talking about differential diagnoses is, yeah, which identification will help paint the best picture of the kid? Is autism really what's going on, and that's what's impacting the education? Is it actually a language disorder?
Yeah.
Which one is the bigger fish? I guess I use like a lot of like, what's the
Totally.
big fish or the big rock that we
Yeah.
like when we think about this child and their access to education? What's the big fish that we need to like, or the biggest fish that we need to paint a picture of?
Absolutely. I think about, I've had students in the past that have had multiple identifications or multiple medical diagnoses. And the kind of tricky part for the school is like, okay, yes, we have this diagnosis of, medical diagnosis of autism, let's say. And then we also have this medical diagnosis of maybe like a genetic disorder or a cognitive impairment or something like that. So then the school, paperwork wise, has to go, okay, what have we determined is their biggest impact on educational access, and kind of what do we put as their primary eligibility identification on their IEP?
We see this a lot, specifically when we have autism and intellectual disabilities co-occurring. And it can go either way depending upon the child. This is why we do the differential diagnoses. I've seen children who have both in their medical history, and sometimes we go with intellectual disabilities as their main identifier because that's what's impacting their education the most. Sometimes it's the autism. Once again, why we come together as teams to have these conversations.
Yeah. Wanted to kind of circle back to what you were talking about with like deficit-based language, especially in these standards and indicators. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. And if you are a parent of children with complex needs and you go through the Medicaid process, you'll know intimately what I'm talking about. Oftentimes, when we deal with organizations that talk about children with disabilities, everything comes from a deficit-based approach, which means we are centering what your child can't do. I don't like it. I think that's not fair to them because that's not their whole picture, right? However, it is unfortunately part of the bear that we have to deal with in order to access the resources on the other side of this. And so when we get into eligibility meetings, unfortunately, we have to talk a lot about what they can't do. Or what they're not doing, and how it is different or deviant from what is the typical, going back to our mathematical typical. And that can be really hurtful, for lack of a better word. It can be really hurtful. I can't tell you how many times Maggie and I were writing reports together and be like, I feel like I'm just roasting this child.
Oh my God, yes. And it is because in that setting, especially to get kids the services that they need to be successful at school, we have to paint a really thorough picture of how they're not measuring up to their typically developing peers. And that feels, well, and is unfair. And so as much as we try to write strengths-based reports and focus on what the students are doing, what they are capable of, sometimes, like when comparing them to typically developing peers, it is rough. Yeah, and I think about one of my close friends has talked about how like when you have a child that is your heart walking around outside of your body, and so I am not a parent, and so I can only imagine how hurtful it is to sit in a meeting and hear a bunch of professionals who have known your kid for like a few years maybe rattle off a bunch of things that your child is deficient in. I can only imagine how hurtful that is. And so that is I think something that like the tide is maybe turning as neurodiversity affirming approaches become more and more popular, but the government and education systems are slow to change. And so even though I do hope that the tide is turning, it is an unfortunate piece of a lot of this process.
It is. And so let us be the first to say, we hear it, we don't like it. And we want to be sensitive to the fact that like this is your child is more than the things that they can't do. And unfortunately, part of the ways that we can help them is by writing to what they can't do. And so we don't like it either. And so we're walking side by side in the fact that like this is not this is not what we enjoy. This is not my favorite part of this job. When it comes to writing the ways that we can get your child services. So unfortunately it is part of the game that we have to play, but doesn't mean I like it. So
one more thing I wanted to touch on really quickly with autism before we move on. And autism is a big one. We're not going to spend this amount of time on all of the eligibility criteria. Autism is a big one that we see and we are involved in. As you're reading these eligibility criteria, if you are familiar with like the DSM-5 diagnosis criteria for autism, these are not parallel, like it's not the same. And that goes back to schools aren't diagnosing. We are looking for, and in my brain, these eligibility criteria are really pulling for key features of autism and also associated traits with autistic people and students that are likely to have the biggest impact on education. So obviously communication is going to have a huge impact on education, language development, speech development, that's all going to have a massive impact. And then it talked about they talk about communication, social impact was another big one. So relating to people, events, or objects, forming relationships with people, and interacting in ways that are age appropriate and expected. They do mention seeking consistency and exhibiting rigidity in routines or preferring sameness and consistency. But yeah, these don't line up exactly with the kind of two pillars of autism that you see in the DSM. And it also doesn't note a lot of other kind of tangential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where you would see maybe talking about sensory profiles, or you might see things like dietary habits or things like that talked about in a medical diagnosis for autism. We don't really talk about that at school.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's important too, because, oh gosh, I'm not going to get my soapbox out. I'm going to get my soapbox out and I'm going to put one foot on it. Okay. And not stand
I'm ready. One foot on the soapbox. Let's go.
Those things are not diagnostic. Like they're not. So this is something that I see online a lot. And as more and more information about autism comes out and more people are educated on it, which is fabulous and I love, there is also the ugly specter of misinformation that is ever present in the online sphere. So things like sensory differences and dietary preferences and dietary needs, those are not diagnostically indicative of autism. They're things that go a lot, like coincide with autism a lot and are present in the autistic population at higher rates than a typically developing population, but they themselves are not diagnostic criteria. So something you'll see online a lot is like, if your child has really intense sensory needs or kind of adheres to that beige diet, like those are symptoms of autism. They're not. They are associated traits. And so that, to me, semantically is a really important difference, because you can have sensory needs and sensory preferences that are indicative of an entirely different disorder. Things like having a trauma background, intellectual impairment, other disorders or
sensory processing disorder itself.
Yes, like those. It's really important to not say those are key symptoms of autism just because they are correlated strongly with autism, because that can send a person seeking a diagnosis down the wrong path. If you're like barking up the tree of autism and the issue is actually, sensory processing alone, that it's important to differentially diagnose, right? And so that's also kind of present in the school identification process, is we want to make sure that it is actually autism that is causing this and not something else, so that we can support it in the best way possible. That is one of my big soapboxes, because I'm really tired of seeing things online that are not diagnostically indicative of autism that are made out to be that way. So
absolutely. Autism's really having her moment, but with that comes miscommunication.
yeah, there's a ton of misinformation online right now, and shocker, you can't believe everything you read online. And as much as I do love people being empowered to identify traits in themselves, and self-diagnosis becoming I think like easier and easier to access with the amount of information, which is great. With that, like if you have kind of this set of symptoms or patterns of behavior in your own life that you're seeking answers for, I also want you to be seeking the correct answer for yourself, and so if that's autism, then I'm glad you found that answer and you can support your needs and get help having your needs supported. But if it's not autism, then supporting autism is not going to do anything for you. So that's that. That's my little soapbox. Foot is off the soapbox. All right. Do you want to jump on to, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, I feel like the next I'm looking down the list and I'm trying to hit the ones that I feel like we work the most with.
Yeah.
In that I feel like the next one on that list alphabetically would be intellectual disabilities, but I feel like we kind of touched on that already.
Yes. I was going to say, could you talk about emotional disturbance for a little bit?
Absolutely. My special education hot take is that we don't use the category of emotional disturbance enough. I understand that those are two huge charged words. However, before I get into it, it's one of the, I wouldn't say easier, but it is a identification that can come and go quickly for a kid who just needs support at a higher tier than the school can provide in non-special education realms. So I'm going to touch on emotional disturbance. I'm so fascinated by this this eligibility criteria. So in order to qualify for an emotional disturbance in the state of Missouri, you have to demonstrate one or more of the following characteristics. And those are as follows: the inability to learn that cannot be explained by an intellectual, sensory, or other health factor, the inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and tendency to develop physical symptoms or fear associated with personal or social problems. And in order to do the evaluation process that you needs to include observations of behavior in different environments and an in-depth social history. And the evaluation has to document that this has existed over an extended period of time, and characteristics are existing to a marked degree. So that is a much looser interpretation of what could be impacting a kid's academics when it comes to their emotional state, as opposed to something like autism, which had tons of criteria that you had to meet. So this is one thing that it makes it very easy to maybe get, or maybe easy is not the right term. However, this is an identification that you have to only have one of those things present in order to consider this as an option. And it also means that if you're going and these things have been remediated through special education, it's also pretty easy to offload through the evaluation process again when you go for dismissal. And I think we should use it more. I think specifically in this day and age, we have a lot of kids who are having emotional behavior things that are not explained through intellectual disabilities, through sensory differences, through other health factors. And so it's, I think we should use it more. I think it could get kids behavioral help. But like I said, emotional disturbance is a really stigmatizing word, so I understand why we don't use it a ton.
I was going to say, I think that I would encourage listeners not to balk at this maybe like archaic terminology, because
absolutely.
we hear it.
We hear it. We know what it sounds like.
It's archaic.
It's archaic and it's very stigmatizing, which is why I
Totally.
understand that it's not used more. However, when you think about those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characteristics that needed to be present, that could describe a child who is in tiered behavior services right now and maybe is not progressing in tiered behavior. So, or tiered behavior interventions. So I wish we would consider this more and get past the stigma of the name. Understand that I know what it sounds like.
We hear it.
I hear it too. I hear it too. And that's why this is my hot take.
Yeah. And I think another, in the criteria, there are 2 notes down in 800.3. Note 1, an extended period of time for this eligibility identification would be defined as like 2 to 9 months. So if a kid is going through or has gone through a really traumatic event, that could be being placed in foster care. That could be having a death in the family. That could be experiencing some kind of traumatic event like a car crash, a shooting.
This is not something that's acute, right? This is not something that is happening because an acute incident has happened. This is something that's pervasive. It's been continuing for a long time and not in response to something that is like a moment in time, like a car crash, death in the family, so on 100%. And so forth.
So just like in the medical field, things like anxiety and depression can't be diagnosed unless the symptoms persist. Most of the time it's for longer than 2 weeks. This eligibility category would not be identified if it had only been taking place for a number of weeks, like as a response to a traumatic event. And then the other note, is just saying that same thing. Yeah, so children who experience and demonstrate problems of everyday living and those who develop transient symptoms, so meaning they come and go, due to a specific crisis or stressful experience are not considered to have an emotional disturbance. So kids are allowed to process trauma in a way that is, healthy, and that wouldn't necessarily, again, land them in special education. This would be emotional disturbance that has been going on for a number of months, close to a whole school year. 9 months is a whole school year. So,
and also my interesting language fact that goes along sometimes with emotional disturbance too is that and why we would be involved in the care of a kid who qualifies as emotionally disturbed is that sometimes, and I know acute, whatever, we talked about the acute thing, that's a caveat. However, if you have a child who has had multiple adverse childhood experiences, it only takes 3 adverse childhood experiences to permanently change the language centers of the brain, which is why we would be involved, is because sometimes children who have behavioral disorders, conduct disorders, or so on, sometimes have different language abilities. And so, anyways, that's why we're here.
Yeah, totally. I think, moving on kind of down the list, I think you were right. The one that we are going to see next is intellectual disability, or the one that, not speaking for all SLPs, because our populations are all different, but speaking
and also we've worked at schools that specifically have programs to support children with intellectual disabilities. So in our experience, we have probably a higher incidence rate than SLPs who work at schools that do not have specialized district programs.
Totally. I think that this is an identification that you and I have come across in our careers specifically a lot. Because of that, we worked in a school with specialized classrooms for this. I'm doing
the same thing now at a different school. And so this is a population that I specifically seek to work with, because I love it. And so, this is one that we have a lot of experience with, and I can't remember, which is why I'm glad we're doing this. What's the eligibility criteria?
I was going to say, this is another big one. So this is one that, and by big one, I mean like hefty. The standards and indicators is 3 pages long. So there's a number of requirements that kids have to meet to receive this identification. And that is for good reason. Intellectual disability, especially if it's kind of in that mild to moderate, can be slippery. And by that, I mean, like, it can look like a lot of other things. It can co-occur with a lot of other things. So having this many boxes that we have to check before we say, yes, we are identifying them with an intellectual disability. Again, another identification or diagnosis that carries a high level of stigma, which we can get into if we want to spend 7 hours talking about this.
Multiple soapboxes, not just one. We're like walking across a soapbox stage.
On top of each other. Yeah, soapbox stage. America prizes intellect, I think, a little bit too much. But anyway, it's important to check all of these boxes to make sure that we're really sure that this is what's going on here. Because again, this is another way, like, that intervention-wise, we would support this really specifically. So we want to make sure that this is actually like their big fish to fry, and not something else.
What's next on our list? Other health impairment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's get into this one. OHI.
This one, OHI, I feel like is also having its moment in the schools because it is another one that is quote unquote easy to get. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I don't know yet. I don't know. Jury's still out.
Like it's less that it's easy to get and more that it's a wide net. Like
this is such a big, you know what? That's a good point, Maggie.
Yeah, this is one of the catch-all diagnoses.
It's
so like
because OHI is, once again, different child to child.
I said diagnoses again. It's one of the catch-all identifications.
OHI can mean so much. And TLDR, too long didn't read version of OHI is that a student has a medical diagnosis that is impacting or an other health impairment that is impacting their access to education. This could be anything.
Yeah, it really could. I have seen this.
Down syndrome often falls
I was
under
going to say,
OHI.
a lot of times you'll see Down syndrome.
ADHD falls under OHI.
I've seen CP too, cerebral palsy.
I've seen cerebral palsy here. I've seen pandas here. I've seen, it's a big net. It's a big net. And I feel like most commonly now I'm seeing it for a lot of kids with ADHD. And so, I don't know, man. That's another one where I'm like, and the jury's still out yet on how I feel about this.
Well, and sneaking a peek at some of these eligibility criteria. So like we said like I was just saying with intellectual disability, that standards and indicators document is 3 pages long. This one is 1, and it doesn't even go to the bottom of the page. Like it's
a half page.
There are not very many boxes you have to check to be able to qualify a student under other health impairment. I kind of fall more on the not that this is like a debate at all, like pros versus cons. I think that that's on purpose, and I think that that's a good thing.
I do too.
Because so like just taking a peek at some of these indicators.
You know what? Sorry, I'm interjecting. I've made up my mind now about how I feel. It's a good thing when it's done well. How about that?
Okay, yeah. And I do agree. You can get yourself into some hot water ethically by abusing the fact that this doesn't have very many indicators. So a kid that maybe it would be better served on a 504 or better served in RTI, response to intervention, and does not actually need an IEP, which is a big, hefty legal process. You could perhaps make a case that they would qualify under OHI. Should you be doing that? Ethically, that's how you can kind of get yourself into trouble, which is, I think, what you were getting at earlier.
That's what I'm getting at. That's my beef with this is when it is used and abused for children, and I see it specifically with ADHD, who might have some type of behavioral component secondary to ADHD that could be treated tiered wise, but maybe gets shoved off onto SPED because of being quote unquote too much. That's when I get like kind of about OHI. However, that being said, I like OHI for the fact that it is so broad. because it is a really wonderful way to get children the help that they need. And I have had so many times when I'm like, oh, this kid didn't qualify SL, like specific learning impairment, or they didn't qualify under learning disability or LI, but oh my gosh, they do have this medical diagnosis of X. And so we can qualify OHI and we can get them services this way. So I've had both sides of the spectrum, which is why I'm getting some of this like dissonance, I guess.
Yeah.
But like I said, I like it when it's done well and with thorough research and thorough diagnostic testing. But I don't like it when it's used and abused for children who it's not appropriate for, but they
Yeah.
just happen to have a medical diagnosis. So
And that
there's
all goes
my
back to-
soapbox.
Yes. And that all goes back to what we talked about in our first episode in this series, least restrictive environment. So if a kid can have their needs supported and excel in, or be supported, be successful, that's what I was, be successful in school on a 504, or in
Or just
tiered
or even
support.
just accommodations within the classroom that don't have to have a document going on with them.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I
So,
digress.
yeah, we could again, if we wanted this episode to be 7 hours long, it easily could be. Yeah, so some of the indicators for this are having a comprehensive health evaluation by a licensed health professional, so a doctor, a PA, or like a nurse practitioner, something like that, where you have a legitimate medical diagnosis of a chronic health problem. You also, or so if accepting that, they would also have to have a comprehensive evaluation that has a condition not requiring a medical diagnosis. So they have ADHD listed here as not requiring a medical diagnosis, which I don't really get that, actually. I'm a little confused with.
It's basically diagnosed by not a medical professional. This is somebody like an LPC, a licensed professional counselor, a licensed psychologist, a social worker, or a school psych.
That's it. Yeah, sorry. I just didn't keep reading. I read the first sentence and then stopped because that's helpful. Yeah, and it lists licensed psychologist, professional counselor, blah, blah, blah. Totally.
And the important part of this is that it's either this is an or diagnosis. So it's either they have something from a doctor or they have something from a evaluation by somebody like an LPC, school psych, whatever. And they have documentation that indicates that their health impairment results in limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including heightened alertness to environmental stimuli, which is where for some of my kids who have medical complexities, this is a wonderful identification category because they do have either heightened or lowered environmental alertness or strength, limited strength. So that you have to have both of those things in order to qualify for OHI.
Yep. Yes. Awesome. Okay, I was just skimming to make sure there's nothing else that's big on that one.
And it has to impact their ability to access their education. Once again, always coming back to, and at the end of every page about eligibility criteria, there will usually be a blurb about documented educational impact, as well as these other criteria.
Yep. All right. I think learning disability we could touch on next.
This one is one that I say with love and light kind of confuses me because it's so big.
Yeah.
This one is one that is 4 pages, 4 pages long. Because they have subcategories.
I was gonna say that's because there's different flavors that you can get there.
I'm gonna touch lightly on this because it is so big. Yeah. So in order to qualify for a specific, is this SLD? Is that what this is?
It is specific learning disability.
A learning disability, a specific learning disability. You can have different flavors of a specific learning disability in the flavor of basic reading skills, reading comprehension, reading fluency skills, written expression, math calculation, math problem solving, listening comprehension, and oral expression. And each one of those has its own eligibility criteria.
Yeah. And again, not to pull out the soapbox once more, but a lot of these read as language to me.
I
Where
agree
I'm
with
like,
that.
I think that this
Which touches on something that you and I have talked about and sat through professional development on, which is our role as a related service provider. Because if we can justify that a child would benefit from related services or their access to special education, not just their regular education, but their special education, would be benefited by having a related service on caseload. Obviously, you have to go through the evaluation process, blah, blah, blah. We can help them. We can give them services. You don't have to have qualifying scores in language in order to access speech and language therapy in special education, which is why I love being a related service provider. This is one of those times. You don't think about how much language touches things like math, but if you've got a math word problem and we're having issues with comprehending quantitative concepts, more than, less than, equal to, greater than, less than. I think I just said less than twice. However, language touches everything. So
yeah.
anyways, this is another thing that just reads as a lot of language.
And I think this eligibility category kind of grinds my gears sometimes as a allied health professional, because I feel like if a child were to receive SLD in reading comprehension, the implication is that they're fine in every other category. This is a specific learning disability just in reading comprehension, which, like, you and I have seen that be the case. Some kids are truly one of one, and they have a really hard time for whatever reason with this isolated skill, and it's affecting them academically and they need support. A lot of times you're going to see they're generally kind of low in a lot of academic skills, and then there's one that is really like standout. And so that kind of like specific learning disability. Also, sometimes you'll see like dyslexia, like schools don't diagnose dyslexia. A lot of times if a kid has a diagnosis of dyslexia from a clinical psychologist or something, their IEP is going to say specific learning disability in one of these reading categories. So yeah, that's kind of like my weird issue with it. It's not really even an issue. I want people, especially parents and caregivers, to understand that there's like levels to this, and all of those different flavors like communicate and touch each other. Like they're not there. This makes
They
it
don't
seem like
exist in isolation. Yeah, they don't exist in isolation. Oftentimes, there are factors outside of just the identification that are playing into that identification.
I think we could probably the next one alphabetically, and the one that we see the most.
And the one that I have the eligibility criteria memorized.
Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, no, so the next one is language impairment, and this is the one that we deal with the most, or this is kind of the one that when LI is talked about at the eligibility table, people look to the speech path to talk about. So in order to qualify under a language impairment identification in the state of Missouri, obviously you have to do the in-depth social history and all of the wonderful things that come along with this. But the big thing is that you have to have significant significantly below expectations are defined as 1.75 standard deviations. And if you'll refer back to what we talked about not yesterday, yester episode, yester episode, last episode, we have to have a evaluation report that documents the results of 2 or more composite standard scores composed of receptive language, expressive language, functioning in a single standard score that is 1.75 standard deviations below the mean. So one test has to have a standard score of like 74 or lower, and then we have to have another standardized test that has 74 within the standard error of measure, which we also talked about last time, which is the range of scores it could possibly be within your 90 to 95% confidence interval. And in order to qualify for a language disorder, you have to have both of those. And then you also have to do either like a language sample or a classroom observation or something like that. But the big beast for LI is that you have to have 2 standardized test scores below a 74,
Yeah.
or with one within the standard error of measure.
And I kind of going back to what we said at the very beginning, I'm not meaning this to be like prognostically. So like in the future, will they ever be successful language wise? That's not what I'm saying here. Like hear what I am saying, which is 1.75 standard deviations below the mean is low. Like that is a significant impairment. And for that to be the absolute bare floor minimum for a child to qualify for language impairment in the schools, that is a really, really significant impairment. Because kids that are, if you're one standard deviation below the mean, you're already outside of average range. Like that means that you are performing below average when compared to a sample of your peers. You have to be almost a whole other standard deviation below that to qualify. This was the thing that like really broke my heart a lot of times. Being a school SLP was seeing a score of 1.5 standard deviations, knowing that that kid is struggling, knowing that they are below average in this area and that they need support, and not being able to qualify them in LI. Another thing that was hard about this was the very first legal requirement is a description of a lack of response to intervention. So for LI, there has to be some kind of general education, tier 1, tier 2, tier 1.5 type of a intervention that we have to try it, see, make sure that it fails, and then we can go forward with this whole process of identifying it.
And that was a conversation I just had with our RTI team at my new school, which is what qualifies as no progress. And so it depends on who you talk to. And I don't know if there's one solid answer. Mm-hmm. However, it is, in order to go forward with testing an LI, they have to show no progress in response to any interventions, which is really hard, because if they're showing even the slightest of progress, that will kick your testing out another 6 weeks or whatever your cycle or your data cycle tracking.
I was going to say, usually those kind of like data cycles are like 6 to 12 weeks. Like I've seen kind of anywhere in that range. 12 weeks is almost a whole semester. Like it's 2/3 of a semester. And so like, if you are doing RTI for a kid, and this is the hard part, again, as an allied health professional, of seeing like, in my professional opinion, this child needs support. We cannot give it to them until we check these boxes. And I mean, in a really intensive way. They're still getting support in the classroom. And
in the context of special education, we can't help them until we check these boxes. And that hurts.
It sucks. It really, really sucks. And those kids that, again, 1.75 is low. Those kids that are kind of hovering around the 1.5, 1.6 marks, those are going to be the kids that are getting that in-class assistance, that in-class intervention, that we're seeing a little bit of progress, that incremental progress, but they need more. And we can't prove it. That like drives me crazy.
Those are the kids that keep me up at night. Truly. Like, thinking about numbers as I'm falling asleep, being like, oh my gosh.
And there used to be, so the standards and indicators for LI changed back in 2020. There used to be a caveat where the SLP could use professional judgment. So those were for those, like, sometimes we'll call them like bubble kids, of like the kids that are on the bubble, they're on the cutoff, where like they are so close. They're truly like, maybe they scored, the qualifying score is a 74. Maybe they scored like a 78 and it's not within like that standard measure, you know, but they, like, we see it, everyone on their team sees it, the parents see it, like, we want to give them support. That professional judgment caveat was kind of in there for those kids of like, yeah, look, they performed outside of qualifying scores on, I think they had to have one qualifying score or something like that.
It was one qualifying score, and then you could do professional judgment. However,
I was in grad school in 2020, so by the time I was working, that was already gone. And I heard people talking about it, but I never experienced it as a clinician. So it did make it a little bit harder to qualify kids for LI. which is tough. So
that is tough. It is very tough. But that professional judgment piece still kind of exists in speech sound disorder, where for speech sound disorder, you have to either qualify through a standardized test that shows a speech sound being 1 year or more developmentally delayed. So that means the child is a year older than the typical age that we would expect a child to acquire that sound. If you're doing a single sound error, if you have a child with multiple speech sound errors that are considered to be developmentally appropriate, but there's a lot of them, this is one of those ways that we can do that professional judgment where we're like, they're technically developmentally appropriate. However, there's so many of them that it's probably a good idea to go ahead and start treating them. Sometimes that can be a phonological process. Sometimes it's just a lot of speech sound errors. But I feel like it still kind of exists there. But yeah, rest in peace, professional judgment in LI, because it's gone now.
Yeah, and I think another thing worth noting for sound system disorders, so this is those like speech sounds. So a lot of times when if we're like out in public and we go, oh, I'm a speech therapist, the first thing that people say back is like, oh, so you help kids with speech impediments, or like you help kids say their R's. This is that piece. This
is a stereotypical piece of our job.
This is the stereotypical piece, which like, yes, speech impediment is not something and not a term that I would use as a professional, but that is kind of the lay term for a lot of what's going on here. And another thing worth noting here is that the Missouri designated normative data for acquisition of speech sounds is not aligned with our governing body, ASHA, the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, not aligned with their normative data. So
no, in a way that is not good.
Yes,
it could be not aligned and better for us. It's not. Because Missouri. However, so what this means is ASHA says these sounds should be acquired a lot sooner than Missouri does. A big conversation that I have a lot about this is specifically with R. Everybody's favorite R. If you can't hear the sarcasm in my, they have it at 8.
Yeah, 8.
8. So that means if your child has is saying W's for R's or vowel sounds for R's, to qualify for an IEP with that, you could not see them until the age of 9.
Yeah, because it has to be a year delayed.
So, a year delayed, which is why I do really love speech tiered interventions, because at least for my district, we can start working on R, I believe, in 1st or 2nd grade, which is a lot sooner than 9.
And that's just for some like context. If you're not familiar with elementary school ages, 9 is 4th grade. So like 4th graders are, if we like can't have them on a speech IEP for that sound until 4th grade, which is late. Very late. And where I want to get these sounds worked out sooner rather than later, not only for neuroplasticity and all of
motor
that,
planning.
like motor planning, all of that stuff that comes along with early intervention. By 4th grade, we are starting to run into, I'm like, my allergies are hitting me like a truck today.
It's fall in Missouri, babe.
It sure is.
Rough out
here. Everything
is
dying. So anyway, we start to run into that social piece. For better or for worse, kids can be nasty to each other. And by 9 and 10, kids start to become more aware of the ways that they are different from their peers. And if you're a 9 or 10-year-old who's not saying their R's, that can start to impact you socially and emotionally. And that is hard.
Not what we want. We want
not what we want.
Not what we want. We want not that. So,
and like, yes, we should absolutely be raising our students and teaching our children to be kind and be compassionate towards others that have differences. But we also live in the real world where that is not the case 100% of the time. And the social impacts of speech sound disorders really can't be ignored. It's just not realistic. So yeah, that's another one that, and then this is another requirement is there has to be a documented lack of response. So like you were saying with RTI at your school, you have to be able to prove that this kid is not making progress with speech in a group once a week or something like that to be able to get them on an IEP for just speech sounds. Kind of tough to do.
Very tough to do. Very tough to do. Interestingly, Missouri splits out fluency and voice into their own identification, and so fluency would be stuttering.
Mhm.
And so for Missouri, I actually have never read the fluency criteria because I've actually never worked with a fluency kid while in the public schools.
So I was going to
Um,
say fluency and voice do not come up very often. Like these are really rare to be impacting a child to the degree that they would be on an IEP for it. That is pretty rare. I have had two. I've had, oh no, because that was a different setting. In the public schools, I've had one fluency student. And voice is even more uncommon.
Even more uncommon. Oh my goodness.
Because that usually would be, voice is already a speech therapy specialty. Like that's already
I consider
niche.
voice, yeah, I consider voice to be the med spa of speech therapy.
I know
Because
that's my like really mean take on it.
I don't know if it's
And
necessarily
maybe
mean because it's like it really does improve people's quality of life and like
it
it does
does.
have like very
Absolutely.
big medical purposes, just like how, Botox can be used to treat migraines, voice can be used to treat nodes and polyps and things that do actually have like really big impacts. But it's just so niche and you have to like really seek it out. It's not
It's so
like
niche.
and also you have to be a specialist in it. Like, well, there's no extra certifications, but where we are considered to be generalists, people who work just in voice do just voice.
Yeah,
Um,
I could not jump into a voice clinic right now. I would
no.
have to do some pretty heavy duty CEUs.
Mhm.
And I say that's like my mean take on it. And it's because uh, it is kind of like the med spa of SLP where like it absolutely improves people's quality of life 100%, but it is so specialized. It's so niche that, yeah, we just don't really see it a whole lot. Yeah, voice, especially in children, this is not one that comes up a ton
No.
unless there is some kind of structural
I was gonna say, unless you're having
difference.
structural differences or like a medical diagnosis that would impact voice, like what is it called? Velopharyngeal insufficiency, VPI.
Yeah.
There's two VPIs, velopharyngeal insufficiency and velar incompetence. Maybe they're different. I don't know. I'm really harkening back to grad school right now. And so, yeah, for your voice to be impacting your access to your education, it would have to be very significant. Yeah, it would have to be impacting pitch quality or volume. So pitch being either too high, too low, quality being roughness, breathiness, or strain perception,
Mhm.
and excessive vocal effort, volume too high, too low, decreased range or unsteady volume. And then there's a couple other
And I feel like
criteria, but
a lot of times, so we're saying this is rare because it would be exceedingly rare to see a child on an IEP with their primary identification being speech
mhm.
voice.
Yes.
I have seen students with multiple disabilities, OHI, or something else have a voice type. Usually it's like a prosody thing, like a
Mhm.
pitch. Um,
Or even like a motor speechy dysarthria kind of
yes,
flavor, which would be secondary to a diagnosis that would probably have a primary identification of OHI, multiple disabilities, or something else. Very rarely is
100%.
voice the only thing that's going on. Voice
100%.
can
Usually
yeah.
voice is indicative of something else. And actually there
Mhm.
is a caveat in here for the evaluation report has to document that this voice disorder is not the result of a
Mhm.
temporary condition.
Yes.
So a cold or laryngitis or something like that.
Or,
Like it has to be a chronic problem.
gosh, I'm really harkening back to voice days. There's like
Adenoids.
no, it's gone now.
Okay.
There's like a temporary like where your vocal folds like get out of their like normal feedback loop, and it's very like psychosomatic y type situation, and you know what
Oh,
I'm talking about.
the paradoxical vocal fold movement.
Yes, oh, we got there in the end.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, that sounds terrifying. That is a very spooky disorder. And this is why I'm really not trying to be mean to voice SLPs because I would have to refer out instantaneously for that.
Mhm.
It is paradoxical vocal fold movement. So wow, this is a super tangent. But anyway, basically your vocal folds cover your windpipe and vibrate together to create the sound necessary for speech. Usually this happens, you can control it. You control when your vocal folds touch together and make noise. When you are breathing, they open up to allow air to go through. Paradoxical vocal fold movement is when that signal is interrupted and
it's not moving the way it should.
Yeah, so the vocal folds will come together when you try to breathe, and it results in that really strident. Yeah, and it can be terrifying because you are struggling to breathe.
And the reason why I bring this up with kids too is because I know that it has something to do with sometimes sports, like heavy breathing with sports can sometimes throw it out of whack, which is why I bring this up. And so
again, very rare.
Super okay, this is even like new level of tangent for us because we're really getting into the weeds now of speech therapy. Anyways, usually voice outside of things like paradoxical vocal fold movement, usually it's secondary to some type of other diagnoses, neurological usually. Anyways, way weedy tangent there, but yeah. All this to say, voice is very rare.
Yes, very, very rare to be not secondary to something else. The last one that we will interact with a lot is obviously YCDD, but we've already talked about that. Traumatic brain injury. Do you want to speak on that for a little bit?
Yeah, this one's not super common in the schools. However, when it is, we are usually heavily involved. Cognitive communication, or just language is housed in the brain, right? And so when you have a disruption or injury to that, 9 times out of 10 we're involved. This can go for things like anything from word finding all the way to pragmatics. And so this is another one that is usually a pretty like self-explanatory identification ability. You have to have a medical history and doctor sign off on saying, yes, you have a traumatic brain injury. And then you also have to have demonstration, once again, that educational impact. You have deficits in the ability to acquire and retain and generalize skills from learning or secondary to the brain injury. And then you also have to have deficit in one or more of the following areas: building and maintaining social competency, which can happen with brain injuries, performance of daily functioning skills, like ADL type things across all settings, which ADL, activities of daily living, ability to acquire and retain new skills, and ability to retrieve prior information, all of which are impacted when you have a brain injury. So,
yes. And this is one that like a child may have a TBI, but it is like kind of housed under another disorder. Like I've had kids on my caseload that have TBIs, but it presents through, they also have cerebral palsy. That was like a result of a birth injury that caused cerebral palsy. So they have that kind of TBI that is secondary to that. Not all the time with cerebral palsy. Sometimes there's
other things going on there.
There's other things. I've also seen it with like multiple disabilities where a child had an injury early in life that affected their brain and also caused a lot of other disabilities. So it was kind of wrapped up in that. But yeah, this would usually be, a TBI is the result of a trauma to the head. So this would be the result of a car accident or, horrific things like abuse.
I have a friend who has a brother who has a TBI, and it was a sledding accident.
That also, it can be total accidents, and it can also be like
the
dark road I was going down, which
the dark road she's going down is abuse.
There's abuse can result in TBI, or even things like gunshot wounds that results in TBI. If God, I'm being so dark right now.
Dampen the mood, Maggie.
I'm sorry, brought it way down. It is just.
It is
though,
things that we can see in the public school. Children who sustained head injuries. For people who live in areas that have refugees, blast concussions. That's a common form of TBI,
totally.
Specifically for very specific refugee populations.
Yeah, unfortunately, horrible things happen to children sometimes, and that can result in lifelong injuries. And we are here to support that because they also deserve to live life to the fullest and receive a robust education. So
we love FAPE, free.
That's why we're here.
Public education.
Yes. All right. We zoomed through a few of those. We got into the
Mhm.
weeds on a few of those. Any
Mhm.
final thoughts on?
Yeah. So when you're at your eligibility meeting, based off of the testing that you guys determined at your RED meeting or your review of existing data, you will look at what areas your child does qualify, doesn't qualify, and you'll pick from those 15 options that we just talked about as to what paints the picture of your child and what supports they could possibly get or not get. Interesting caveat, if you get to the end of this and you're like, "No, I don't want this," you can technically say that.
That's
Um,
true.
if you were so inclined to do so. Um, I'm gonna leave my personal opinion out of that. Um
I'm not. I'm going to say that. I'm going to say that like we've been saying this whole episode, my professional recommendation, again, you are within your rights as a guardian to leave that on the table. My recommendation would be if we have data supporting that your child needs special education, my recommendation would be to go forward with special education. Because
we're tangenting again. I want to address something too, because I feel like the number one concern I hear from parents who are considering not going forward with identifying their child for special education is they're like, well, I don't want them to feel different, and I don't want them to, students to view them differently. I want you to know the speech kids are the coolest kids in the school, and and that's not just my personal opinion. Oftentimes, they're getting pulled by other adults. We go and we do things that are different in their school day, and they are the envy of all of their peers.
Really, there's that piece to it. And also, I just want to say, like, the disability is going to be there whether we label it or not.
Mhm.
So you get to choose as the guardian, do you want your child to receive the support that they need, or do you want them to struggle in school? Like that is it's like the trend right now on Instagram of like, if I weren't afraid of hurting your feelings, here's what I would say. Like I truly believe that we've talked about how some of these eligibility criteria, you have to be scoring real low, showing a significant need for support in school. If your child is meeting those criteria, we have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they need support in school to succeed. So to kind of leave that on the table and walk away, I would want to have a conversation about, okay, then what are we going to be doing to support them, because they obviously need something. And yeah, that's my 2 cents as a professional. Again, it is ultimately like your choice as a caregiver, what you choose to do. But in light of receiving information like this, my recommendation would be to go forward with special education testing or special education services, even if it carries a stigma, because that disability is going to be there whether we talk about it or not. So,
and I'm serious. The speech kids are the coolest in the school. So
I really do. So many times I'll darken the doorway of a classroom, and kids, especially in the younger grades, go, "When do I get to come to speech?"
Oh,
and I've never seen this kid in my life. I'm like,
no,
I don't know.
I don't know.
Not today.
Mm-hmm.
So
nope. I can't tell you how many times I get like harassed. Is it my turn to come? No, but
nope.
sorry. It got to be cool to get the speech club. So
yeah. So yeah. That's a lot. We could have the 7-hour version of this where if we had a Patreon, I would be like
the director's cut
for the director's cut, which is us for an entire day yapping about each one of these. And yeah, because there's a lot to it. And boy, do we have a lot to say. So
boy, howdy.
Boy, do we love to talk about is really the
oh my
the
goodness.
takeaway from this.
Well, thank you for listening this far. Yeah, thank you for listening so far. Because this has been a very tangent-y episode about some things that we care very deeply about. So, I forgot what I was going to say.
We are available on YouTube and on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube at Tell Me About It and SLP Podcast. That's the name of our channel. Same on Spotify. And we are also on Instagram at Tell Me About It SLP, which we post clips from our episodes and other fun stuff that you can check out there. But yeah, we hope that this cleared up a few things about the eligibility process for special education. And join us next time for, I believe we have one more episode in this kind of school-based series that we're doing where we talk about the IEP meeting itself. So we will be getting into the weeds on that next time. So join us then.
Bye.
Bye.